Well, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Boy, it's great to see everybody here. We keep getting better and better turnouts, and this is great. We set up for 80, and I see we're setting up more tables, so this is great. Announcements again. I'm going to talk about this meeting is being recorded. If you have a question, please use the microphone. It's actually doing two different things. Number one, it's speeding up the meeting. And number two, then the people that's online, and when Hal does the editing, he doesn't have to cut you out because we can't hear it on the video. So please use the microphone. We really need a volunteer for the membership coordinator. He took a president's job at a VFW or American Legion, and he's not with us. So Bill said he's pitching in and he's taking it over for now, but we really do need somebody to volunteer to be the membership coordinator. I really don't know all of his functions on his job. Bill could probably talk more about that. You want to say something about it, Bill?
I just took over the job, and we'll see what I can describe. There is a database that we keep with everybody's information on it. You fill that out, new members fill that out, and we put that into a database. We print out name tags like these. We send out membership cards, send out notices that your dues are due. I'm hopeful that once I learn this a little better, that it'll go quicker than it's gone this week. But it's not real difficult. So if you have some specific questions, I'd be happy to sit down with you one-on-one. Don't everybody volunteer at once.
Yeah. You can hear a pin drop. If you have any pictures of any classes that you took, in classes that you taught, send pictures to me. I'm still trying to build a gallery of all of the work that we do and all of the classes that we have in the shop. And if you have them in your shop, just send them to me. We're back in the wood business. Tom was able to get some more wood. He'll talk a little bit more about that later. Well, we can talk about that now. Tom has got wood in his truck. There's a sign-up sheet. So if you pick up some wood, go ahead and sign the sheet on what you're taking. Let's see. If there's things posted on the forum and you help that person out or whatever, if you can answer the forum and say, hey, I've got this, or I'm working on it or something, that would really help out. I get people contacting me going, hey, what about this? What about this? Well, I don't know. I'm not the one working on it. So if you can just say, hey, I'm working on it, then that would work out great. Okay, do we have any new members here tonight? Come on up to the microphone. Tell us who you are and what you like to work on.
My name is Jim Betcher, and I'm working on end grain cutting boards and a kitchen table.
All right. Welcome.
My name is Chris Rolfe. I'm just getting into the woodworking scene. I'm not actively working on anything yet. I'm still kind of brainstorming.
All right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Welcome. Any visitors?
My name is Jared Young, and I came to a meeting a couple years ago with a friend and trying to come again and see what's going on and participate.
All right. Welcome. I'd like to thank everybody, to start with, everybody who donated toys. Every month in the newsletter, they show a list of everybody and all the toys that they make. I'd like to thank everybody for that. We've collected over 300 toys tonight, and so far this month, we have delivered 412. Tom Turney is the head of the Home Sweet Home and the tables. Come on up, Tom, or want to walk over to the microphone and talk?
Okay, for everybody, I want you to know we're getting close to 50 tables. We'll probably have at least 60 by the end of the month. These tables are the small ones. We're going to do a show and tell. Steve Bernhard made a table. They're small. You can go on our website, get the plans. They're end tables, coffee tables, nightstands. The wood is donated by a barrel builder, a foodier, and it's 8-quarter white oak. So it's good to work with. It's fun to work with. It mills up really nice, makes some pretty tables. Just takes a little work gluing stuff together. So if you're interested, go out on the website, check it out. It's under Community Service Projects. Home Sweet Home is the charity that the tables go to. You can check them out as well. It's a very good cause. We have about 30 people building tables and would like 30 more people, because we'll hit 60 tables, but they could use about 600. So there's always a need. People always have that need. So the guys that have built them, we thank you. We appreciate it. There is some red oak downstairs in the rear of my pickup truck. If you take the boards, they're pre-cut, but they're rough sawn. You'll have to work on them. If you take them, just sign the sheet and the number of pieces that you take. And we will have a day out at Faust Park where we're going to be distributing wood. It'll probably be not this Saturday, but the following Saturday. Check your emails. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Brian.
All right, thanks, Tom. And Wayne Humphreys chaired our Christmas toy program this year. He did a wonderful job. I'd like to thank Wayne for doing that. And Wayne wants to come up and say a few words.
Over on the two tables over there, kind of a sample of the toys that we built this year. And final count's not in yet, but we're going to be over 1,200 toys or sets of toys that we're donating to the Toys for Tots and the various charities. And when you look at sets of toys, some of them may be 4 cars in a bag. There's more than 3,000 individual items that will have been built to be distributed here at Christmas. And I'd like to thank some of the people that were involved in this, up to their elbows in some cases. Linda Turner, anything over on the tables that has paint on them that required any artistic skill at all, she's probably the one that painted them. And we certainly appreciate all the effort she put into that. Bill Muth has built the baby carriages, the stick horses, and the Adirondack chairs, and donated the dolls and the teddy bears that go with those. And Carolyn Devaney has made the blankets that go with those. So appreciate all their efforts. Vicki Berry and Bill Schucott have been involved in this and out every time to build stuff and keeping things going, and lots of times that requires some effort to figure out where we were at the last time we stopped and what we need to do next to make sure we keep going. Paul Deutsch built a bunch of the big trucks and at home, and but anyhow, take a look at them. A lot of effort's gone into this, and a lot of them have been distributed already. The rest of them will go out to Toys for Tots sometime after Thanksgiving. Now, all the wood that everybody donated early on in the year, I appreciate that, and be asking for more donations after the first of the year when we kind of get a handle on what we're going to build for next year. Anything that can be donated is just something less that we have to buy. So appreciate everybody's input into this program. Big success, and we'll shoot for the same type of numbers next year.
All right. Thank you, Wayne. And thanks to everybody that helped them. Okay, upcoming classes. Next class, beginning woodworking class starts 12/3. Bill Schucott's teaching that one. Next one is beginning turning, and that's a full class already, and there's another one in the works. Bill sent out a list, and I'm looking through which dates that I want to use. for that because there's a few opens. And then the 7th of January is another beginning woodworking class. Yes, Bill.
The beginner, in the past, the fundamentals class has involved some fairly sophisticated handwork. And what I found was that people who were not familiar with shop tools had a tough time keeping up with everybody else. So we set up a separate class called the beginners class for people that are not familiar with the equipment in our shop. And that class, the first class is full. At this point, no one has signed up for the second class. And I'm hoping that there'll be some others that join in. Basically, I'm going to have 4 projects that beginners can try and get a hand, working with the joiner and the planer and bandsaws and stuff like that, table saw. If you are not familiar with the equipment in our shop, we want you to take that class before you sign up for the fundamentals of woodworking. There is a new fundamentals of woodworking class starting January 15. It's not been posted yet because I have a waiting list, and I gave the people on the waiting list until 2 days ago to let me know that they wanted to sign up. So I'm in the process of getting them signed up, and then the fundamentals class will be open to the rest of the membership. So.
All right, thank you. Upcoming presentations. In January's meeting, we are going to have a wood carving demonstration by Glenn Miller. No, not the band director. He's from the St. Charles Woodworking Group. Then we're got Dan Birchtold. He's going to discuss the sawmill industry. Then in March, we are going to have Charles Sapp talk about wood turning tools and all of the tools that are related to wood turning, because in April we were going to have a wood turner come in and he's going to turn for us. So there's some of the presentations that we have coming up. And now the next thing we have coming up is a Superstar Weekend. And here comes Dan to tell us more about it.
All right, it's been several years since we had the Superstar Weekend, but we're going to have one next year. Tom McLaughlin is committed to come to St. Louis to spend the weekend with us. He's from New Hampshire, or Canterbury, New Hampshire. He has 25 to 30 years of building commissioned furniture, and he's been on TV numerous times and has been a number of articles printed in the Fine Woodworking Journal. And for us, he's going to present all the aspects of bending a bow front sofa or end table. He's going to talk about the design, how to make a bending mold, veneering, making a curved front drawer, adding detailed veneer inlay, and finishing. You'll find that if you're at this workshop, that Tom is very approachable. And what separates Tom from all the other instructors is his ability to teach. He not only shares the what, the how, but also the why. Tom really dives into the design and why we do, or why the design is what it is, and what joinery is appropriate for the article that you're building. So we're asking you to register early, and if you do, you're going to receive a discount. And the prices are going to increase February 1st. So get in there, and in the price, lunch is included. So registry will be through using our guild's website. So we're still working on the venue details, but registration will open soon, and you will not be disappointed. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dan. There we go, show and tell.
I'm David Gronefeld. I'm the shop manager, and we got a couple new items in the shop. One of them is what's on the screen now, which is the router table. It's got a cast iron top and a new lift. Lift is now installed. It's got a fence that goes along with it, and a couple other accessories as well. We also have ordered a new 20-inch helical head planer, and so that should be arriving in the next couple of weeks. So we'll be putting that in the shop as well. If you'd like to be able to learn more about those, I do need some shop managers, particularly on the weekends, and if anyone would like to volunteer, that usually entails working 4 hours as the shop safety monitor, and your duty usually comes up every 3 months or so, so about 4 times a year is what it usually works out to be. You come to the shop and you open the shop and you monitor that everyone's using the equipment safely, and then if you're the one that's there at the end, then you close up the shop and make sure everything is secured and put away as it should be. So I could use a little help with that if anyone has that ability. Mainly it's on the weekends, and again, it's a 4-hour shift. Usually there's one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Let me know, and I'll get your name down, and then we'll have a training session so that everyone can become familiar with the equipment that we have in the shop and what the procedures are going to be in the shop. So just let me know if anyone's interested in that. Thanks.
Got it. Yep. All right. Okay, now if you have anything for show and tell, if you want to come over this way, get mic'd up, and come up on stage. So the first couple are mine. I made this thing a while back for my wife, and she decided she didn't like hanging it on the wall. So we've been looking around. I didn't make the frame. It was cheaper to buy the frame from Michael's with the coupon than it was to make the frame. So that was one of the things I made. And then one of our members asked me on the board if I could make him something for his shop, for his safety glasses. So he sent me a pattern that he got offline. So I made him this eyeglass holder for his shop. Yeah, so it just fits in there like that. So yeah, so that's I made that for Dan Lender. Okay, next.
My name's Steve Briner. I took it upon myself to take Tom upon the offer of the white oak that he had. I took enough. I ended up making 2 of these. I was probably about 20% short of material, which I kind of knew ahead of time. I was able to get all 8 legs from a piece of white oak that the previous owner of the home that I'm at left behind. And I needed a few other pieces besides, but I just finished it with Watco, a couple coats of Watco Danish oil, and put a satin lacquer, just deft spray lacquer on top, and I think it turned out pretty nice. I have no idea what I did with the dimensions for the original that I built 20 years ago. And so at least I've got one that I was able to copy. So unfortunately, if somebody would be interested in building one like this, he really would have to come over to the house and measure up, which you're free to do. But so anyway, that's my contribution to the Home Sweet Home.
All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is John Ferreira, and it's a vase I made out of a maple root ball. That was all one piece of wood. And poured epoxy. That was a little challenging, hollowing it out. Started out with high-speed steel tools, and would only turn about 15 seconds and need to resharpen because I was hitting limestone in there. So then I went to carbide, and I still had to resharpen 3 times to finish it. And that's got an epoxy finish on it.
Beautiful. All right, thank you.
Steve Michael, and I wanted to make myself a wood hinge box. And the hinge is the same species as the wood, so it doesn't show. I got the idea from Rob Cosman. I don't know if anybody's seen that. But in order to do that, you have to make a dowel that's the same wood. And I found out that if you use just a metal die, you can run a square piece of wood through there and get a dowel coming out the other end, and it very precisely. The other thing you have to do when you make the hinge is you have to section it and put it back together with small pins. So you have to drill a hole right down the middle of the dowel. In order to do that, I created a jig that allows me to put the dowel into it and then drill the hole right down the middle of it. So, kind of a fun project to teach myself. It's amazing what you can find on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Next up, Shellac. Why not? Brad, come on up.
Good evening. I got permission from Steve to use this as my podium tonight, and I heard Steve say that this was coated with lacquer, but Steve, I'm gonna, even though this would be okay for my water glass, I'm gonna keep it back there. So our topic tonight is shellac, and I titled this talk, Why Not Shellac? And my hope is that if you have never tried shellac, by the end of tonight, this opens a door and you decide to give shellac a try as a finish. I think it's got a lot of advantages. We'll cover a few disadvantages, but anyhow, if you've tried shellac before and you had a negative experience, I hope that there's something in the talk tonight that might answer a few questions and prompt you to give shellac a try again. And if you already use shellac all the time, I hope I don't put you to sleep tonight. So I want to take a minute and just do a real quick look back at and let you know my prior experience with finishing wood. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Most people had paneling in their homes. My first recollection of a wood project was finishing pine baseboards to match paneling, top coating it with poly, and using steel wool. Sometime after that, my dad had a finishing shelf out in the garage, and I have a picture of it. I took it recently, and it looks like it did as I recall it back in the 60s. But I pulled a can of shellac off of that. I can't say that I ever saw my dad use it, and I would have to say that I was in that negative experience camp after trying to use shellac. And I don't even remember what I tried to use it on. I do remember I liked the smell of it. I never went back and used it again for several decades. My experience after the baseboards while I was in college, I built a fish stand for a 30-gallon tank out of pine, and I had a chop saw at the time and a cordless drill, and I built a couple of plant stands. And because we do what we know, I went back to stain and poly and steel wool on that project. I then didn't do much until I got out of professional school. I acquired a table saw, a 10-inch Delta contractor saw, and I got a book on how to use a table saw, and I decided to do a hard maple raised panel chest, which looking back wasn't very easy to do on a table saw. And I went back again to that same finish that I mentioned twice before. And then we had a couple of different houses, and I spent a couple decades using latex paint in a house. My kids got older. I stumbled up to woodcraft. I hadn't been up there for 10 years at least, thinking maybe I'd do something, and I saw a flyer that Cecil Robertson, who's now deceased, very active member in our guild for a long time, was teaching a class on Windsor chairs. And so I signed up. There were 3 of us. I learned about milk paint, putting it on in layers, distressing through it to show different layers and give an aged patina, and boiled linseed oil. So that was my first step away from the old stain and polyurethane. That led me to have an interest in chairs, and I started looking online and saw Sam Malouf's furniture, and I just spent a whole year thinking about building his rocker, went and took a class, and the finish on that was a wiping varnish, a mixture of probably tongue and linseed, varnish, and wax. And so I did a few projects with that. And then I decided to get a little bit more education. I went over to Mark Adams' School of Woodworking. I took a class with Steve Latta in inlay, which is used heavily in federal furniture production. And the finish on that typically is our topic tonight, shellac. And I also took a class by Al Breed on carving. What made me do that, I can't say I know for sure looking back, but that is a technique that I've used in a number of the pieces I brought here tonight. And shellac is a very common finish used on reproduction furniture that you want to make look antique. And my most recent experience with shellac was buying a 1952 home and having paneling in the basement, and I found out the finish on that typically was an amber shellac. And the only other thing I forgot is I spent quite a bit of time towards the end of that pedigree that I just gave in my experience with finishing, doing turning projects, and I really found shellac to be a nice finish to use, especially on turned boxes that are lidded that you turn pulls for. Sometimes on bowls, not as much on bowls. So let me move on if I get this to work. This is kind of a compressed view of my dad's shelf. That's out in the garage, which is an unconditioned air garage, and those cans, who knows how old they are. Dad typically didn't label cans with a born on date or bought on date. And so I'm going to explain a little bit later why I might have had that negative experience that I did with shellac, and hopefully you guys will be able to avoid that. This is the paneling in our basement. Amber shellac gives a nice kind of golden brown honey type appearance to wood. And if I hadn't had experience in how to spread shellac at that point, that probably would have been a difficult thing for me to redo our basement. But actually, I found it quite enjoyable. So I wanted to spend a few minutes now, and I was going to actually try to have Doug load up a video, but the video was 12 minutes long. He reminded me that I really needed to limit this talk to an hour or less. My wife also reminded me of that. And so I'm going to try in about 2 minutes to explain where shellac comes from. But I would encourage you, Shellac Finishes is a company that's based out of San Diego. I'm going to mention them a couple times. The guy that runs that, Mr. VJ, has a passion for using shellac. He has actually patented a few types of products that actually add even increased durability to shellac. He's got probably 10 videos on there about how to spread shellac with a brush, how to pad it, which is a version of the French polish technique. And he's got this really nice 12-minute video that goes over to India, where most of the shellac, India and Thailand, comes from. And it really walks you through a nice history of this type of finish. And so the lac bug occurs in the northeastern part of India and Thailand. It's a very small bug, about the size of a apple seed. And the female bug deposits her eggs on specific trees over there and feeds on the sap. And the sap imparts some of the coloration that you get to shellac. It's very noticeable in the different options you have with buying shellac flakes and then dissolving them in the solvent to make your product that you're going to put on wood. The eggs in the female get encrusted in a resin that is then harvested as a product that's called sticklac. And it's filled with little twigs and the eggs and many dead lac bugs. And that is goes through a purification process. A lot of it is done by hand over there. Typically, this process yields about 2 crops a year. It takes about 100,000 lac bugs to produce a pound of shellac flakes. So that is a lot of activity. They take some of this sticklac and they use it to inoculate, if that's the right term, the trees each year so that they've got a healthy crop of lac bugs to produce this product. So if you watch his video, it does a much better job than I just did. And I would encourage people that have interest to go onto our website and find that. So what are the primary finishing options that we use in woodworking? And I'm just going to give a couple little points about them. Shellac is an evaporative finish. The solvent is denatured alcohol. The solid is the shellac flake product that's harvested. The shellac melts into itself, so each prior layer that you add dissolves into the layer below. The dry time on it can be, depending on the humidity, and it can be as short as 10 or 15 minutes if you wave it and run air across it. If it's something like Baltic birch that you're putting in the floor of a drawer or something, that stuff dries lickety-split. You can put on multiple coats quickly. Typically to sand it, ideally you want to let it dry for 60 minutes, maybe even 2 hours. The next finish, polyurethane, is a synthetic finish. It's not an evaporative finish. It's typically suspended now in either water or oil. The water-based polys tend to dry quicker, more on the 2-hour time scale. I don't use those a lot. I have a couple of times. The oil-based, a little bit longer. The polyurethane tends to cross-link, so it's a mechanical finish, and each coat you put on sets on top of the prior coat. Typically, you ideally need to abrade the coat that's below it. I did bring some 3M and Norton abrasive pads. That's an option. Sandpaper would be an option. But typically, you want to abrade so that you can get those layers to adhere and not delaminate. I can't say that I've ever had that happen, but Steel wool also would be another option to use. Varnish, our third finish. Varnish dates back several hundred years. Some of the products were coming from trees and dissolved in turpentine type. The ones that we typically use today are usually mixed with oils. Some examples, usually it's linseed tongue oil mixed with varnish. Examples would be finishes like True Oil. The Maloof finish is another example. Danish Watco oil is probably the most common that people are familiar with. The oil content retards the drying, and usually you end up needing to let that dry for, if you're going to top coat it with something, even as long as 3 days, but typically you can recoat after about a 24-hour drying period. The last one is lacquer, and I have no experience with lacquer, but it is an evaporative finish. The layers do melt into each other like what I described with shellac. It has a quick dry time as well. One of the big hindrances with that is the VOCs with that. The vapors that come off of it are definitely probably the most toxic of any that we're showing here. They're toxic in that if you inhale them, get them through your mucous membranes, they get into your nervous system and can cause all kinds of problems. And so those are principally the four finishing options that I wanted to mention. And now we're going to talk specifically about the uses and spend the rest of the time on our topic of shellac. So shellac has been used and been around for a few thousand years. It was used in the Orient long before the Europeans used it. One of the early uses was extracting some of the dye that, again, came from the bug and the relationship to the different tree and the coloration that came through the sap. It was used as a protectant over paintings. It's been used extensively in the food industry. Pure shellac, aside from the solvent, is non-toxic. It's used in a coating on a number of candy foods, jelly beans, pardon? Did somebody say? M&Ms, Milk Duds. I've got some of this written on my papers that I brought, and I've kind of migrated away, so I'm going to try to just do this from my memory. But so it's used as a coating on fruits to keep them from aging as quickly that you see in the grocery store. It's used in the pharmaceutical industry as a coating on pills. It's used in some of the delayed breakdown because of gastric acid, and in how some of these pills, it's been a cosmetic additive. It was used as electrical insulator, jewelry adhesive. It has been pretty extensively used as an odor and stain blocker. I suspicion possibly my dad back in the day, pine, the quality of pine was much better, but you still had knots. A lot of them bled through sap. I suspicion that Dad might have used it for that and then gone ahead and latexed over, painted some of the pine. And it's been used in the construction industry. It's not got a lot of high levels of durability in a floor coating, but it was used to cover floors. It's been used, as we're going to talk about, extensively in the furniture industry. So a lot of the 18th century furniture, I was surprised to read, actually had wax applied to it. Certainly shellac and varnishes were also used. A lot of that waxed furniture was shellacked over in the 19th century. And so through the entire 19th century up until about the 1920s 20s when nitrocellulose lacquer was invented. Shellac was really the predominant finish that was being used on furniture. This is a gallon of denatured alcohol. That is the solvent that you dissolve shellac flakes in. A gallon of that now I think runs about $20. Denatured alcohol is basically ethyl alcohol or grain alcohol, about 95%, and the other 5% often is methanol or wood alcohol. That was put in so that it wasn't drinkable. It's not taxed like drinkable alcohol is. Unfortunately, methanol is what puts off some of the toxicity. The toxicity levels with shellac are low, especially relative to lacquer. If you have a very poorly ventilated space and you're in there for an extensive amount of time, shellac can be absorbed through your nasal membranes, through your eyes. If you get it heavily, repeatedly on the skin, it can be absorbed through the skin. If you certainly ingest it, which has been done in the past, it can lead to blindness as one of the early symptoms because of it permanently damaging the optic nerve. It is quite flammable and can be used as a fuel for some of the stoves, so you don't want to use it around any open flames. As I said, you don't want to consume it. You want to limit prolonged exposure. Shellac, though, just the smell of it is actually a very pleasing smell. A lot of the things we do in our shop, especially if you have a house based shop, a basement shop, a lot of the odors transmit into the house. And shellac, the odor dissipates very quickly from the denatured alcohol. And the product really, if you haven't ever smelled it, to me, has a very pleasant smell. Pardon? Oh, sorry, I think I heard a yawn. I won't ask if there was a reason behind that. But, so how do we know what the concentration of the solid is in shellac? And that's an important thing to keep track of. That is determined by the pound cut. And so what that means is the amount of shellac solid dissolved in a gallon of denatured alcohol. So when you say you have a 1 pound cut, that would be 1 pound of shellac flakes dissolved in 1 gallon of alcohol. And I'll go on and mention a little bit later some of the pound cut amounts that are in Zinsser, which is the only product that's available aside from buying flakes and dissolving them yourself. So an example, if you were to mix this up, would be most people would not want to mix up an entire gallon. So you're going to mix up a smaller amount of that. So if I wanted to make a 1 pound cut, I could take a 1/4 pound and dissolve it in a 1/4 of a gallon, which would be a quart, and that would be a 1 pound cut. If I wanted to take that 1/4 pound and dissolve it in a pint, that would be a 2 pound cut. Does that make sense to everybody, how that's done? And how many people have been dissolving their own flakes if they use shellac in here? So probably a good 5, 6 people. I actually have not. So I have used shellac fairly extensively. I have never bought flakes. And I'll explain my bias, but I think you can make a case for either way. If I was going to try it for the first time, I think I would go ahead and try the product that's already made, which is Zinsser. So Zinsser is a company that's been around for about 160 years. Back in the 19th century, there was a lot of competition in the States for shellac. There were several companies. They all went out of business. Zinsser held on after lacquer became predominantly used after the Depression era. They really saw such a decline that they started marketing their sealer product. And so their sealer product is a de-waxed product. I believe it's, yeah, seal coat here on the right. That light is so bright I was having a hard time seeing. The seal coat is a 2-pound cut. It doesn't have any wax in it. I failed to mention earlier that when the bug lays the shellac secretion, it's 95% shellac, but about 5% wax. And that wax has some protection that I'll mention for how shellac degrades. But actually, Zinsser puts an extender, does something chemically to where their product is marketed as being good to use for 5 years in the seal coat. The other two products is a clear waxed product and an amber product, which is what I used on the knotty pine that gave the honey coloration. Those are 3-pound cut. So it's nice to know those pound cuts, because when you start to use it, you're going to want to dilute it down from that most of the time, because if you add more solvent, it's much easier to work. It flows out easier, and it's going to reduce some of the frustration you're going to have trying to get comfortable using shellac. So again, the two on the left, 3-pound cut, they both have wax. The seal coat is 2-pound cut. So this is seal coat on the left, 2-pound cut, that doesn't look cloudy. The 3-pound cut clear that has wax has that cloudy appearance because that is the wax that is suspended. When you first open the can, that wax is going to be on the bottom. And if you were to leave that wax there and siphon out what was on top of it, you would have 3-pound cut of the shellac solid without the wax, and you would have just made your own de-waxed 3-pound cut. So that is something some people talk about doing. The other thing, you can pour out a small quantity and let it set for several days in a glass jar and do the same thing with a small amount, if you so chose to do that. I personally prefer to go ahead and use the seal coat, because basically it is the same product without wax. It even dries a little bit harder, the de-waxed products, and I usually don't ever have a situation where I personally have used a 3-pound cut of shellac. Is there anybody in here that uses shellac, that uses that high of a pound cut when they're doing finishing? Nobody. So my experience has been similar to everybody else's. So de-waxed shellac is a little bit clearer. It dries harder. It has better adhesion when you top coat it. So if you're using shellac, one of the downsides is that it does scratch somewhat, and it has limited water resistance. Some people say with fresh shellac that is de-waxed, you can set something that's got water like a glass and leave it about 4 hours. I haven't tried that, so I'm not sure. The nice thing about shellac, though, is it is repairable, and you would typically be able to repair water rings on shellac by taking the solvent, a little bit of oil on a rag, and rubbing it over the area. And typically it dissolves, as I said, it melts in to the other layers, and it will allow that water to come up out, and would be something that you could fix. And I also have seen online people say that they use waxed shellac and top coat it with poly or wiping varnish and have not had a problem. But most of the recommendations are to use the de-waxed products. So if you've got a tabletop And if you use shellac under it and you're going to top coat it, typically you could spray lacquer over it. You could use poly over the top of that. And then you would have a much more water resistant, less scratch prone, durable finish on the top. And the other thing that I'd written at the bottom there is the flakes that are de-waxed, and you definitely can buy de-waxed flakes. They also have a shorter shelf life. The wax around the flakes adds a protective coating to them and helps reduce the oxidation of the flakes, which is some of the reasons why it starts to break down and can fail. I like to keep a lot of these yogurt containers available. They have a lid that you can write on with a marker. And what I will typically do is take a known quantity like this. I'll go into my de-waxed seal coat shellac can and take out a volume. Usually I'll fill this up, and then what I may do is take and fill this up again with denatured alcohol. I'll pour it into one of those yogurt containers. I may write the pound code on it, and I will now have a 1 pound cut. If I want to do an initial wash coat, then I may put 2 cups of the solvent to 1 cup of the 2 pound cut. And then I'm somewhere down in the 1/2 to 2/3 pound cut. And that makes a really nice initial wash coat if you just want to seal your wood and then do something else with a colorant on top of that. The denatured alcohol won't dissolve the plastic in these yogurt containers. I know this information, if you don't eat yogurt, is probably not good to some of you, but and I have before put a mineral spirits based finish in some of those, and I've found it running out on whatever I've set it on, so don't make that mistake. But I find these very good to be able to write on and keep track. The other thing I do with them is I tend to add trans-tint dye quite a bit to shellac. So trans-tint dye is very tiny particles, much smaller than what you get with stains. They get absorbed down into the wood, and they mix well with either water or shellac. And I find shellac will, as a wash coat, raise your grain a little bit, not nearly as much as water. Typically, you would want to give it a very light sanding after you do that with something like 300 to maybe even 600 grit sandpaper. So Zinsser as a company, prior to the mid-1980s, I believe, which is when they sold to Rust-Oleum brands, they used to put a very easy readable date on their cans. You would have the date there. You could look up and see that the products had the 3 to 5 year extended life over what shellac flakes that are dissolved, and you would know where you sat. You would know that you were buying a can, how old it was from the date, the born on date. You can't do that anymore since they were bought up by Rust-Oleum. They use this lot number, and so you have a sequence of numbers up there that I found out online, and this was long before I did the talk. I looked this up, and so there is a 4 run sequence there that includes 3 numbers and a letter. And so basically, I've drawn arrows, and again, I even did some of this before I knew I was going to give this talk, but basically that hodgepodge of lot number on there would mean that the last The first 0 is the end of the year. So you would have to know that we're in the 2020 run, so that would be 2020, November the 10th is when that was born on. So you can write that out so you can remember it if you want to know where you're working from when you're out to a point where this product is likely to stop behaving like you want it to behave when it dries. Now, probably a better solution than that is to, if you've had something for 6 months to a year, is to do a dry test with it. You can take a drop of shellac, whether you mix it up with the flakes or whether you buy, like I do, with the can. You can drop it on a piece of plate glass or probably a piece of melamine as well. Let it run down, give it about 20 minutes and push on it. And if it's sticky and not wanting to dry, then it's probably gone bad. Or rarely, if you're adding extra solvent to it, the solvent occasionally take on water vapor and become bad, the denatured alcohol as well, but that would be much less common. I'm going to say a little bit more about the flakes and how long they're good for. I just wanted to show that, some pictures about what you would need to do. So if you buy the flakes, usually they're sold by the half pound or pound. The Zinsser products have gone up. The denatured alcohol has gone up. Zinsser is about $22 at the big box stores per quart. Now, if you buy flakes, the shellac finishes that gives a 10% discount on our website, on our guild site, under the sponsors, I believe. Their half-pound rates for waxed and de-waxed flakes is about $25. They're up around the low 40s for a pound. And most of the stuff Lee Valley sells, and there's several other companies that sell shellac flakes, typically are in that 30, sometimes even 40 for a half pound. Some of them do things to try to extend the life of their flakes. You want to keep them in an airtight container. You want to reduce the oxygen. You want to put a desiccant in there that pulls any moisture out of the bag. These flakes can go bad as quick as about 6 months. I'm going to explain a little bit more about storage. This is just a picture of denatured alcohol being mixed. As I said, I've not done this, but typically agitating once you put the flakes into a container helps. You can put it in a hot water bath. You definitely don't want to put this over any kind of open flames. But those are typically the things that accelerate the breakdown of the flakes. Does anybody who uses the flakes have anything to add? Do you have any things that you do that are beyond what I just mentioned and how you get your flakes to dissolve? Nobody? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Yes.
I've used the flakes quite a bit.
Uh-huh.
I use the flakes quite a bit. I get them from Weller Mart. They're about $60 for a pound. I keep them in a bag in a freezer, and I put a little Bloxygen in there with them when I seal them up. And I've had them last for years. You just weigh it out. My experience is the best thing to do is think ahead. If you're going to need 4 ounces of it, make it the day before. When you put the denatured alcohol in there, just mix it up as best you can and let it stand. Every hour or two, you go by it, give it a little turn like you're doing a snowflake seam thing. And usually just give it overnight. And after overnight, there's almost never any wax in the bottom, but I filter it through a paint strainer anyway. And then put a little Bloxygen in with it, and it'll last 6 months, 8 months, even a year. I've never had any go bad up to a year. if you keep the air out of it and keep it sealed up in glass.
Thank you. That was excellent. You stole my next 3 slides too, with what you said. So storage issues. So what contributes to breakdown? Heat, moisture. Zinsser coats their cans. Most people wouldn't probably put these in coffee cans. That would not be a good idea. Direct light. All of those things are true for a lot of the finishes that we use, things that I mentioned in the beginning, our finish options. And then in the flake form, minimizing exposure to oxygen. And the shelf life with flakes that are mixed, as soon as you mix flakes with denatured alcohol, they start slowly losing some of their hardening abilities, but it's very slow for quite a while. They undergo a process called esterification, which you would probably have to be a chemist to understand. I took organic chemistry. I only know such a tiny bit still about any of that. But anyhow, some of the things that were just mentioned, and I'm going to reinforce this product, Bloxygen. So our atmosphere is about 77% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% argon, and 1% of a whole bunch of other gases. Argon gas is what's in Bloxygen. Argon is an inert or a noble gas. That means that it doesn't readily mate with other atoms, and that's because its outer shells are filled with electrons, and they don't combine well with other things. So the density of argon and the fact that it doesn't try to combine with whatever it's laying against as far as a finish goes makes it very good at extending the life of pretty much all the finishes that we use. It probably would have minimal effect in the actual cans of Zinsser, but definitely in these bags that you keep your flakes in. If you could put a squirt of that, it actually pushes the oxygen out, or even if it's still in the container, displaces it away because it sits down on top of the product because it's heavier. And so that can is about $12. I think you can get it from a number of sources. You get about 75 uses or squirts with it. I read typically like a quart-sized can. It would take just a couple squirts in there. You leave the lid partly off in your bag. How many squirts do the gentleman that got up and talked? How many squirts of Bloxygen do you put in your bags that your flakes are in?
In the bags of the flakes, I'll give it a good 5-second squirt when I seal it up.
Okay.
But I'm pushing almost all the air out. But even after I make it, and even in the seal coat, in the Zinsser stuff, I'll put a squirt in there, give it maybe 2 seconds in there in a quart can, and it'll last easily a year without any problem if you do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I read people say that some of the finished products that they use, it extends 5-10 years even with using this type of product. So this is a good place away from the heat to store in a glass jar and label the products that you've made up. And if you're going to let something sit in there for an extended amount of time as well, maybe a shot of the Bloxygen. So these are some of the common colors. The garnet, which I believe is the bottom left, flakes tend to give a ruby, kind of a darker reddish brown color. The amber, I believe, is the one at the center in the bottom, gives kind of a honey or golden brown. That's again the color that was on my basement paneling. These upper two, I think, are blonde, super blonde, some version of that. Again, these flakes come both waxed, which would extend shelf life but reduce some of the hardening properties, or de-waxed. This product, Trans 10, I mentioned that I add to shellac quite often. I have also added it to water. If you buy these, they come in many colors. In fact, Dan Coleman had about 20 bottles of this that he was selling left over from Wayne's estate. I assume that went pretty quickly, Dan, didn't it? Yes. At about $20 a bottle of that stuff. I noticed the price you were asking was well below that. So if you use this, a good idea is to take a safety pin and punch a little hole down through the center, because you want just a tiny hole so you can count the drops that you use. So ideally, if you were making furniture to all go in the same room and you were going to dye it, I used a red-brown dye on these pieces that I have up here. You want to be able to count out the drops and see on a sample board how you're coloring a piece of wood. If you take an X-Acto knife and cut the top of one of those off, you're going to forever be cursing yourself, because you're going to just spew out large amounts of that stuff, and it takes just a little bit. So those are really neat products. So in addition to being able to add a little bit of color and warmth by different varieties of shellac flakes, that you're taking advantage of where the bug is bringing the sap in from what tree and what colorant, Trans 10 gives you a lot of options. I did not do a good job. Some of these pieces were built several years apart, or a couple years apart, in keeping my recipe. And also different varieties of wood are going to take on stains and Trans 10 differently. So I have 3 different versions of red-brown that's put on mahogany up here. And mahogany with no finish looks basically like this. Not a real attractive look, kind of a pinkish salmon look. These lidded boxes that I put up here, both of the bases on the boxes are shellac. One has amber shellac, and under this lighting, which would be, this one's on your left, you can't really see the little bit of extra warmth and kind of orangish coloration. The other one is on the right, your right, is clear. And I also brought some pieces of the wood without any finish on it, just so you could see kind of what shellac does to the coloration. On lighter woods, your maples, things like that, it's not going to yellow and darken the wood like what you get with the oil-based finishes. So that is another advantage if you want to keep your wood lighter. Water-based poly, I believe, the same way. You don't, when you stay away from the oils, you end up keeping more of the lighter coloration to your woods. So how to apply shellac? You've got several options. You can spray it. It does come in a can at the big box stores Zinsser makes that you can spray. I have never used that. I think you can set up your own spraying systems at home. Pretty much all of my experience, other than just a little bit of wiping, has been by brushing. I know there's at least a few people in here. I think Bill, our vice president, told me that he does French polishing. I would refer you back, and I'm going to say a little bit more specifically about brushing technique and French polishing. But I would refer you back to Mr. VJ's shellacfinishes.com videos. He's got some really fantastic videos on the process of building a pad and using it with different motions and adding a little bit of oil and doing some of the polishing. And he's got some really good information about brushing and also where you would want to consider combining the two. And I put wiping really down with pad wiping or going ahead and doing the French polishing technique. I mentioned I mostly have used brushing, so I don't know where, if I ran into a recommendation to use these Golden Tackle-On art brushes on the videos that I mentioned to you, because I did first look at those several years back. But I went to Hobby Lobby and probably 5 or 6 years ago bought that small 1-inch brush on the right. Tackle-On is a nylon product. It doesn't load as extensively with shellac as the natural bristle brushes do. It's a little easier to control the flow, and I'm going to tell you some things about the loading that are important to reduce your negative experience with using shellac. I bought that bigger 3-inch brush when I did the big top on the pie crust table. So I used the smaller brush on the carved elements, on the pedestals and legs. I used the larger brush, which I could have just as well, if I had been more comfortable with polishing, pad polishing, French polishing, done that out in the middle part. Those brushes are on the order of $8 to $15 to buy. I've only bought one of each of those brushes, and I have used them extensively, and I can't think of any other product that any other finish I've used that I've been able to use a brush as many times as I have with using shellac. Part of it is, even if you put it away and there's some residual shellac, even though you've tried to wash it out in the solvent, and it's hard, it doesn't interlock. It melts away if you, when you're ready to use it, stick it back in some denatured alcohol. And that's another plus with using shellac. So the brushing technique, the first thing I've tried to do really with most of the different finishes I use, not just shellac, is load the brush up to the ferrule and then get rid of most of the solvent so it doesn't drip out. And that keeps the upper part of the bristles and the ferrule somewhat, the ferrule area where they're held, from getting gummed up, and it makes it a lot easier to clean brushes. So that would be the first thing to do. The second thing is how much of the bristles to put down in the shellac. And I typically, it just depends on where I'm applying it. I may only put about a quarter of the length of the bristles in. I may put a third. I may even go up to a half if I've got a big area. It also depends on the pound cut. If you were to use straight out of the can 3-pound cut, the solvent evaporates so quickly, you've got really limited ability to work it. I mean, 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, it's drying. If you try to go back over it, if you add more solvent, you've got more time. Even at a 1/2 pound or 1 pound cut, the solvent evaporates off quickly. You're left with your solid, but you definitely have more time to work it. After you load, if you pull it up across the rim repeatedly, as I said, it dries so quick, you're going to get little gummy particles that you're going to be sticking to your bristles. So it's better if you tap it a couple times to get rid of any of the excess, and then you go right over to what you're doing. I'm carrying those yogurt containers around. I know what my pound cut is. I've already added my trans tint in the application I did here with these projects. And you know, when I'm done, I put a lid back on it, stick the brush down in some solvent, and you know, it's good at least for even a couple of months with just the lid on it like that to still be a product that's going to give you the results you want. Usually I don't leave it that long, but you come back out and stir it up. You're periodically stirring it when you're using it. I find that really an easy, quick way to do a finish. When you're brushing it out, you want to stay away from the edge. Usually you want to be at least an inch or two away from the edge. If you've got very much load at all and you come at 90 degrees to the edge of your project, you're going to get massive runs and drips. If you have an overloaded brush and you're on a vertical fall on a surface, you're going to have stuff running down. So really load control, how much you put on the brush, thinking about where the surface is, thinking about how quick the solvent's evaporating is a learning curve with using shellac, brushing it. I think it is too from the videos I've looked at with French polishing. I mean, there definitely is an art to using this, but I think it is worth your time to at least investigate this, because I think it really is a wonderful finish. So when you're coming in, they say think about a plane landing and taking off with your brush. You're kind of coming down and you're lightly touching and extending out. Once you get rid of some of the load to the brush, then you're coming back over to that edge. The videos that are on the shellac finishing site, he starts in the middle, goes out to the edge, comes back, overlaps the middle, goes out to the other edge. He does a coat like that, then he starts another coat a couple inches in from the edge and goes to the middle. And that way his build of the more concentrated is in two different areas. After about 3 coats or 4 coats, then you want to level it out. This product can be wet, dry, sanded. You can use these abrasive pads. You will get some pore fill with repeated applications, and you'll end up with a very smooth finish. If that's what you're after, it takes a little work. You can also go get a commercial, pore filler, pumice, any kind of product that you've used before. I typically have not done anything with pore filling with mahogany. It's a relatively open pore, maybe not quite as much as walnut. Certainly it's not dense to the degree that your cherries and maples are. When you're spreading shellac again, you want to keep an edge wet, so you want to quickly go back and overlap maybe about 1/4 of an inch, and you need to be working at a relatively moderately paced, and that comes from experience. I've already talked about thin coats being better. This is the cabriole leg on the chair I brought in here. One thing I really wish I'd done, and as we do woodworking and we read and we talk to friends and come to meetings like this, I think we all gradually pick up ideas, our knowledge base expands. But one thing I didn't do with projects like this, there's especially cabriole legs where you're cutting down through multiple layers of wood fibers running down. You've got a lot of open areas that are going to absorb dyes quicker than others. And if you don't do a non-tinted wash coat, which again would be more like a 1/2 pound cut to maybe 1 pound, I think I would stay lower than that, then what you're going to get if you go right in with dyed shellac as your wash coat, you're going to get more of that aniline dye or stain absorbing into areas, and you're going to have darkened areas. They don't look horrible because they are all over my chairs that I built, but in retrospect, if you're going for an old time finish and you want it to have different layers of light and dark and to create the look of an antique, you would be better off to seal, then put your pigment, and then after a coat or 2 or 3 of pigment, lightly hit the high areas so that they lighten up, and then you've got this reflection of light and difference of colorant, and then you can come back in at the end of all that and add a glaze potentially, which leaves the recessed areas darker, looks like grime and dirt. And you really, if you look at really high quality reproduction pieces, can make something that looks like pretty close to an original antique. Now, I know most of you probably aren't doing that, and that really isn't even my biggest focus. To use shellac, you don't need to know any of those techniques. To use it just on, you know, like this jewelry box I brought in, clear shellac over that. I wrote out up here what some of the finishes are. I used clear shellac over milk paint on this, ash dovetail box that I drilled holes, and I just kind of made that whole thing up. I had seen Don Snyder bring a sea chest in and seen an article on fine woodworking, and I thought, man, that looks like a challenge, but I don't want to make something big. And so I got out my dovetail saw and started monkeying around and made 2 of these. But I brought this in to show what shellac looks like on a variety of different projects. Another thing with shellac is the ability, and I'm going to mention this as an advantage in the end, but while I'm looking at these pieces, is to pre-finish something. So a lot of your exotic woods have a lot of oil and resin, a lot of things to keep bugs out of the woods. And if I take and turn these pulls like you see here on a lathe, and I've got an African blackwood pull on this jewelry box, I've got a turn top here and 2 turn tops on the lids on these turned boxes that I brought in. They're against a lighter background wood. If I finish that all at once, I would have a river of dark shellac that would have run off that black wood down onto the lighter colors. So shellac dries so quick that you can just throw the tin in of something like that in a vise and run a couple coats of shellac. It's dried lickety-split. You can epoxy with these exotic woods. They don't absorb glue very well, so I find epoxy works as a nice adhesive. So I will have a mortise in something like a lid. I'll pre-finish it, epoxy it in there. The 5-minute epoxy dries lickety-split. I can go back then and finish, you know, and you can really speed up your finishing projects over what these wiping varnishes with oil and even your polys, and you don't have the VOCs that you get with lacquer. So I'm kind of building a case for why not shellac as I'm going along, and I'm kind of wandering since I decided not to look at my papers. I hope this isn't going too far off the rail. So this is a couple coats of shellac. To get a gloss look to shellac, it takes several coats. These were a couple early coats. Again, better off if I had wash coated it before pigment. French polishing, I already told you, I don't have any experience with, to be honest, but I have read about it a number of times. So you start by making a pad. The pad is usually something like a 2x2. I think it's also called a wad. What goes on the inside and is wrapped around with a denser linen usually. The products that I've heard used are things like gauze, cotton balls, I think more commonly cheesecloth, even old t-shirt material can be used. You wrap it with a denser, like a tablecloth, linen, a handkerchief. Some people, I think the Shellac Finishes videos, I think he uses the t-shirt on the inside material, and then, or no, I'm sorry, he uses cheesecloth on the inside and wraps it with, so there's a number of ways to do that. You then load with some solvent and add your shellac. You don't want this to be a dripping mess. The outer cloth, you kind of twist it and kind of hold it with several fingers. You want it to be fairly flat as you run it across your surface. So you'll want to go down with something that doesn't have a lot of dripping shellac to it. You add a couple drops of oil, and then you keep this thing moving. To to build your shellac. And at the end of all this, you end up that oil that you use as a lubricant keeps coming up to the surface. You get rid of that oil by either adding some naphtha, or I think I read even to use a clean pad, to make a clean pad, and just add a little bit of denatured alcohol to it. Will clean up the oil. Is there anybody real quick that wants to add anything to French polishing? So these are some of the things you would have handy if you were making. You would have your water rubbing pad. They've got cheesecloth, linen, alcohol, shellac, and some mineral oil. So I'm pretty much just about done. I had skipped over, because I didn't use my paperwork, a glaze, and I do want to go back and touch for just a second on that. So once you're done with the shellac, if you want to add a glaze to something, you don't want to go back and dissolve your shellac. So you want to use something that is in a solvent that's not going to have that as a problem. So things that would be good glazes are gel stains. I made up a glaze, coal tar or roofing tar. I had a hard time finding that, and Jet Coat makes a non-fibered roofing tar that you can buy by a gallon. It's not very expensive, however, and you can mix that up with a little bit of mineral spirits, and that is an old-timey glaze that really works well against stuff like carvings that I've done. And lastly, before I finish with these two last slides, I want to mention too, if you come up and feel the feel of shellac on these pieces, the smallest table I brought in over here is a contrast piece that's got polyurethane finish on it. So the difference is subtle. It is noticeable. If you're looking to reproduce antiques, for certain you want to use shellac. So the advantages of shellac are the quick dry time. You don't have to have a super clean environment. If you've got a little bit of dust, the fact that it dries quickly is a benefit. It allows you to pre-finish, as I mentioned, and glue stuff up quickly. The UV resistance and the darkening with age, the fact that it doesn't, as opposed to your oil-based finishes, is a good thing. The ability with de-wax shellac to top coat it with almost anything, if it's a tabletop, that you're going to have water setting on. If somebody's going to be drinking alcohol, if any of that spills, that actually would dissolve. If somebody is cleaning their nail paint off with acetone, that would dissolve shellac. So top coating is advantageous in some things. The fact that it mixes well with trans-tint dye, the smell I've mentioned, using it as a blocking or a sealer, the fact that it's very repairable because it's a melting finish, and the problems you're going to get, especially with polyurethane and varnish to some degree, is those layers are sitting on top of each other. If you get something you need to fix, you're going to be able to see a hole that's got some walls to it, and you're really either going to have to do an awful lot of sanding or use a harsh chemical stripper to get rid of your polyurethane to refinish something. You don't have this problem with shellac. And I already mentioned the solvent issues with alcohol acetone. We talked about the fact that it is a natural non-toxic substance used in even the food industry. We've all ingested many times shellac without the solvent. It's transparent unless you add dye or some of the other colored versions. Very smooth, easy to polish. You can leave it more of a glossy finish. It's easy to knock that down with steel wool or some really very high grit sandpaper. Disadvantages are it does have some limited scratch resistance. It does have limited water resistance, which I already talked about. There is some limitation with heat resistance if you were to set a really hot, like a pan on it or something without a trivet under it, and then the damage that you get with spilled alcohol. So I say again, why not give shellac a try? And I believe that's it. I hope, as I said, I didn't ramble too much because I'd intended on kind of going through some notes I put there, and I just didn't do that. So, yes.
A couple of questions. If you have a place where people have put their hand underneath a door opener and there's maybe oil or moisture there that has made it lose its finish, a lot of cabinet makers use shellac. And how would you repair that? Would you have to sand that first, or could you put that clear shellac over it? Would that clear it up for you?
So you're saying it's a shellac surface that has got some defects or oil to it, right?
Yeah.
Well, oil, I probably would rub something like naphtha or mineral spirits because
Okay.
it's not going to dissolve the shellac and see if the oil came out. If it was moisture down in the shellac and it didn't extend all the way down into the wood, then I would take a piece of t-shirt material, not have it dripping wet with solvent, but have it moist with solvent, add a couple drops of mineral oil, and I would rub it on that, and you would start to melt away down to where the water is. Typically that would come up and out, and often that would fix your problem. I have not had to do that as a problem, but I have read in a number of places, and that, to my knowledge, would be a typical way to try to repair something like
So
that.
Napa wouldn't bother the shellac?
Pardon?
The Napa,
No, Napa would be like mineral spirits.
it would just remove it, wouldn't bother the shellac?
No, it's not. And again, like I said with the glaze, if you're putting something on top of shellac, you want to put something that the solvent that is in that will not affect. And really, acetone and denatured alcohol is what's going to break down. So if you have something and you don't know what the finish is, for instance, if it's oil, if it's just oil like tung oil, linseed oil, if you put a drop of oil on it, leave it for a couple of minutes, the oil will soak into it. If it's that kind of finish, usually you can feel the wood grain through that. If you've got a shellac finish, if you put a drop of denatured alcohol on it, leave it for a couple of minutes, and then go to wipe it off, it should be tacky because it's dissolving away the solid, which is the shellac. If you've got lacquer, if you put a drop of lacquer finish, lacquer solvent thinner, yeah, since I don't use lacquer, the term evaded me there. If you put a drop of that on there, I think you only have to leave that on for maybe 15 or 20 seconds and it'll start dissolving, and you'll know. So that separates out 3 types of finishes, and then you're left with varnish and polyurethane. And those, again, are cross-linked. They layer on top of each other, and you almost have to go to your harsh or really a ton of sanding. And then you've got all these uneven. So if it's a big area, probably most people would have to strip and go back to starting.
No, it's a small area. But if it were lacquer, then you'd sand it down, apply more lacquer. If it was a lacquer finish, would you just sand it and?
Somebody that uses lacquer, if
Can
you
repair
could.
it that way?
That's right.
Steel wool or something,
Yes,
just
and
like.
if you don't like it, just, you can, of course, you can strip it off and start over.
But I just want to repair it.
And if you don't like it, just sand it and then redo it and give it several more coats, and finally use some very fine sandpaper soaked in Danish oil.
Okay.
And
One other question.
And lacquer does dissolve. Again, like shellac, lacquer is an evaporative finish that the solvent allows it to dissolve into itself.
Okay. If you had some place where somebody, not me, but somebody else had coffee vapor come up and turn it whitish, could you use a hair dryer to try to draw some of that out?
I don't know. Are
Okay.
you talking
I
about
just
on?
wondered if
Are you
anybody
talking
ran
about
into
on shellac?
Yeah, shellac. I think it's shellac,
think
but I don't know for
That's usually
sure.
moisture down in. I again would go back to the technique I mentioned with a little bit of
Take it
solvent,
off.
a little
Okay.
bit of oil, and try to loosen that up and melt it out. And,
Okay.
and I think you would still retain a fairly smooth finish. You could come back and spot over with some additional shellac and sand it off if you wanted, if there were a leveling issue.
Okay, thank you.
So, sure. Yes, Jeff?
You mentioned storage, and I store some finishes in refrigerator, and even the CA glue I use on pins, I can put that in the freezer. Can you do it in a refrigerator and have it last longer than room temperature?
Yeah, I think so. I think that would be preferable if you put it in the refrigerator. So your shellac flakes, for instance, before you put them with alcohol, definitely storing them in a fridge, keeping the oxygen out of the container would be beneficial.
And if you want to make pins like I do using shellac, can you put 7, 8, 10 coats of it and then finally sand it with something like 800 all the way up to several thousand grit and have it really shine?
You're saying, can you do that with
Yes,
shellac?
will that have that effect?
I don't. I mean, I have never done
You
that.
don't turn.
I don't. To be honest, if I wanted to have a sheen too, sometimes I mean, you can go back over and polish it. With,
Yeah, I've done that.
With solvent. You also can add a wax to it. Brie wax has colorant. If you're not happy with the color of something, you can add a little bit. I don't necessarily like doing that, but there's so many ways to manipulate your color and your sheen. So no, I don't go up and sand to those kind of grits with to try to get a. And I don't think it's commonly done.
Not for furniture.
With shellac, but I think that can come from French polishing in and of itself, even without sanding, that really high gloss, pore filled look.
Okay.
Any other questions? None? Yes?
One last thing. Those watching a football game saw Tennessee really give Mizzou a shellacking, right? It bothered me. Where'd that come from? Anybody want to know? Okay. In 1931 was the first time it was in print, and they in a sports reference. But it turns out, you know, we had prohibition right there, and people never said somebody was drunk. But if you smelled like shellac, they would say you were shellacked, and it came out of a prison term.
Wow.
So if you ever wondered, that always bothers me. You might hear something like that, and you go, where the hell did that come from? So go home and get shellacked.
Good. Thank you.